In most of the newspapers, it brings it back to that hometown perspective, because a lot of the newspapers typically are being written for that audience or that community. We actually have several articles for Charles Leinbach that appear in his hometown newspaper that are constantly being reported, and it's called the Pottstown Mercury is actually the name of the newspaper. And so we're going to look at an article that's published right towards kind of the end when we're trying to figure out what happened to Mr. Leinbach after he was captured in the Philippine Islands. So what are some things you heard? A piece of evidence you can add to his story.
The Bataan Death March, he survived.
Right. So he's a survivor of the Bataan Death March, which we know was very limited in the number of survivors that actually were able to make that entire forced march.
He ultimately died on Taiwan.
Right. We know exactly kind of where he was buried, right, on the island of Taiwan.
He was a lieutenant.
Right. Now you know his rank. At the time of his death, he had achieved lieutenant colonel.
He was attached to the 57th Infantry Combat Team.
Right. So now you know who he was with, the 57th Infantry Combat Team, and this is the Battle of the Philippines.
Two sisters that stayed in hospital.
Good. You get a lot about his family members, right? And also, usually it's reporting information for the family itself, so there's an insular quality to it. What about the travels of the family? They give you some great detail if you start to put it in context with history. They went to where?
Fort Staughton.
Fort Staughton. And who went with him?
His family. Wife and daughter.
Everybody went with him. What's going on in 1940 around the world?
Japanese invasion of China and other islands.
Right, Japan has already invaded Manchuria and China and started the other islands. Go fast forward then. What do you know is on the horizon in World War II?
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor. What happens to Pearl and Lorraine?
They go back. They're sent back.
Right, and they're sent back when? June of 1941. So 5 months before Pearl Harbor, they're gone. Obviously something's happening that's ramped up probably the seriousness, right, in the Philippines where he's stationed at, and they're getting families out. Because it's usually based off of a lot of interviews, maybe that the letters the families are getting, you start to make connections to other documents that you might be able to dig into. And occasionally you'll hit one, like the students we're working with today in my class, that contains just a wealth of information, a lot of different jumping off points.
When was Pearl and Lorraine notified of his death?
She gets notification in 1945. She did know that he was a prisoner of war because there are other newspaper accounts from the same newspaper, the Pottstown Mercury. They seem to be following him, probably because of his rank, right, Lieutenant Colonel. And that's where the story will get really, really interesting. And we'd have to spend some more time looking at the individual deceased personnel file, the IDPFs, which if you remember for him is like 300 pages, because you start to see a letter writing process happening between his wife, Lorraine, going back and forth with another officer, which is a whole other story because his really good friend from the Philippine Islands is now actually one of the guys in charge of notifying families about the choice of bringing bodies back to the United States or keeping them overseas. And she finds this out and she begins this massive letter writing campaign back and forth. They start to see the context of things in terms of history and how some things don't connect and others do. And that's kind of the neat process to see them work through and find out on their own.